Well, DNA technology has enabled a lot of cold cases. These are old cases where the investigation didn't reach a conclusion. These cold cases can be reopened and reinvestigated, provided that the evidence from the crime scene has been properly preserved. These can be reinvestigated with the help of DNA databases. So many countries nowadays have databases of DNA taken from known criminals. So if someone committed a crime long ago, but were never caught, committed a crime later and their DNA was taken, then the DNA from that old case can be compared to the DNA in the database, and if they're in the database, up pops their name. Of course, it only works if the culprit is in the DNA database. But many criminals will commit more than one offense, and this is how they can get caught. So here's an example. This is Leslie Molseed, a young girl who was sexually assaulted, stabbed to death, her body left out on the Yorkshire moors back in 1975. This man here, Stefan Kiszko, was convicted wrongfully of the crime, and even though he was innocent, he spent 16 years in prison. Okay. It took that long before his name could finally be cleared and he could be released. Well, the evidence from the crime scene had been preserved, and when the technology permitted, it was analyzed using DNA, and the DNA extracted was compared to the DNA in the national database, and up came the name of a local man called Ronald Castry. He had a minor criminal record, but it had put him in the database. He was charged with the sexual assault and murder of Leslie Molseed and brought to trial. Problems, though. This is a trial in 2006 for a crime that occurred in 1975. Okay, more than 30 years before. So the first problem is that most of the original witnesses are dead. So the trial had to rely on notes taken at the time. Now, one of the last living witnesses who visited the crime scene was a retired forensic scientist called Ronald Roderick. And here we have problem number 2. Is there proof that the sexual assault and the murder were done by the same person? So as Ronald Roderick said in the case, to do that, it would be necessary to prove that the semen was deposited during the murder of the little girl, and I found no evidence to show that was the case. It might have been, it might not. So what is being suggested here is that Leslie Molseed had been abducted and sexually assaulted, and then released, and had continued walking home, and then had been abducted a second time and murdered. So it comes down to what is considered to be reasonable. Did the jury think that this second problem here amounted to reasonable doubt? And the answer is no. Ronald Castry was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in prison. A second case, also from the Yorkshire area, and also from 1975, but continuing onwards, is the case of the Yorkshire Ripper. And the Yorkshire Ripper, he was given that title by the newspapers, was a man who murdered a series of prostitutes and several other women over a number of years. Now, in 1978, before the Yorkshire Ripper had been caught, several letters were sent to the police apparently from the Yorkshire Ripper, and also a cassette tape with the voice of the Yorkshire Ripper essentially taunting the police. And the police believed that this tape was genuinely of the Ripper, and therefore the voice they heard was his voice. Now, the voice on the tape had a particular strong accent, which is called a Geordie accent, which comes from one particular part of the country. So the idea that the Yorkshire Ripper was a Geordie sent the police off in the wrong direction. Well, eventually, in 1981, the Yorkshire Ripper was caught, basically by good police work, and turned out to be a man called Peter Sutcliffe. But between the sending of the tape to the police and Peter Sutcliffe's arrest, there had been 7 further attacks and 3 murders. And it turned out that the tape and the letters had not come from Peter Sutcliffe. He was not a Geordie. He did not have that accent. They were a hoax. And if there had not been that hoax, the Yorkshire Ripper might have been caught earlier. Well, using the technology of 1978, there was no way to tell who had sent the letters. But in 2005, the case was reopened. Because when you seal an envelope, you lick the edge of the envelope to wet the glue to seal it. And in 2005, they were able to extract DNA from the glue of the envelope. And it matched that of a known criminal called John Humble. So it must have been quite a surprise for him when one day the police knocked on his door to arrest him for a hoax that he'd committed almost 30 years before. And he was sentenced to 8 years in prison for the crime of perverting the course of justice. So the first cases using DNA profile come from the United Kingdom, and the technique then spread worldwide, including to the United States. One early use of DNA technology in the United States was the case of Kirk Bloodsworth. And he lived in Baltimore County, Maryland, and in 1985 he was found guilty of the rape murder of a 9-year-old girl called Dawn Hamilton. In 1986, the following year, because of a legal technicality, his conviction was quashed, but he was not free because he was retried, found guilty once again, and that guilty verdict was confirmed when he appealed. But he insisted throughout he was not guilty. After several years in prison, his lawyers finally forced the state to do DNA tests of the semen that was found in the little girl's underwear. And that DNA did not match Kirk Bloodsworth. So he was released and given back his freedom. Some years later, the DNA from that underwear was compared to DNA in the US National Data Bank, and it matched a known criminal called Kimberly Shea Ruffner. Now the irony is that while Kirk Bloodsworth was in prison for the murder he did not commit, Kimberly Shea Ruffner had actually been in the same prison for a different offense. How far back can we go? Well, we can go a very long way back. One of the people who spent longest in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but was then released due to DNA evidence, was a man called James Bain from Florida in the United States. He was found guilty of rape in 1974, partly based on the testimony of an eyewitness, and it took till 2009 for the truth to be established, and that's when he was released because of DNA evidence. Under Florida law, he was compensated at the rate of $50,000 for each year in prison. As he'd been in prison for 35 years, that's 1.7 million US dollars. But no amount of money can compensate you for the loss of 35 years of freedom. So what happens if the DNA found at the crime scene doesn't match anybody in the national database? Well, then you may have to identify a suspect through other means, or maybe you can find something in the DNA that will help you. In 1988, a prostitute called Lynette White was found stabbed to death. 3 men were convicted for this crime, but on appeal their conviction was quashed, and this meant the police had to go back and reinvestigate the crime. Well, this takes a lot of time, and the crime scene was only reinvestigated in the year 2000. That's a long time later, and the room in which she had been murdered had of course been repainted, it had been redecorated, which I think is a reasonable thing to do if there was a murder in it. And what they had to do was to peel back the layers of new paint back to the layer of paint that was on the surface back in 1988. And they were able to find bloodstains which had been preserved under the paint and extract DNA from those bloodstains. But when that DNA was put into the national database, there were no matches. Or at least there were no perfect matches, meaning that the person whose blood that was not represented in the database. But inspection of the DNA showed, quote, an unusual feature. And when the DNA database was analyzed for this particular feature of the DNA, there were 600 people who shared it. From those 600, 70 were shortlisted for one reason or another, and from those 70, one of them stood out particularly. And he was a teenager with a motoring offense, but he hadn't been born at the time of the murder, and of course his DNA was not a perfect match, so it couldn't have been him. It turned out to be his uncle, a man called Jeffrey Gaffor. So Jeffrey Gaffor was convicted of the murder based upon this unusual feature which he shared with his relative who was in the database.